Hello guys, Crispy here, welcome back to another video. In this one, my friends, I'm going to be testing a GeForce GTX 1650 4GB GDDR5 GPU in God of War Ragnarok. Now, when the game released, you actually needed a mod to be able to launch it on 4GB GPUs, but now it actually works. They've updated it, the developers fixed that. It just says that you have insufficient VRAM here and that this is an unsupported configuration. It may result in poor performance and instability, but it works. If you click OK, it will launch. But before that, I will show you the rest of the specs, of course. You can see all of the GPU specs right here. I'm not overclocking it, by the way. And again, it's the GDDR5 version of the card, a little bit slower than the GDDR6. And over on the left, I'm pairing it with a Ryzen 5 3600X CPU and 16 gigabytes of DDR4 3200MHz RAM in dual channel, CL14. Let's get into it now, shall we? And first up, let's go over the settings. I'm starting at 1080p resolution using TAA native. VRAM is at 130%, as you can see, and we're using the low settings preset here. These menus are very hard to navigate, okay? Anyway, you should definitely utilize low settings with the 1650, you know, and it actually looks really good on low still, so there's no point in using like medium or high settings. And as you can see, the game is actually getting decent FPS. I mean, it's not amazing, of course, but it is playable on a 4GB GTX 1650, so it's very weird that they didn't allow 4GB GPUs to play this, and there are 4GB GPUs that are even better than this one, like the 1650 Super, which is around 40% faster, GTX 980 as well, which is similar to the Super version of this. So yeah, it was a shame that you couldn't really play the game with those cards, just because of a limitation from the developers, you know, oh yeah, you can't really launch the game with a 4GB GPU, it's gonna be terrible, so we're not gonna allow it. Well, it's running just fine at 1080p native resolution. Yes, the frame time graph has some micro stuttering issues, as you can see, but it doesn't really kill the experience. You can get used to it pretty fast, actually. It's not a problem, at least to me. And you know what? It is consistently micro-stuttering as well, so you don't really have a smooth frame time graph in some areas and a completely broken frame time graph in other areas with a lot of micro-stuttering, so it's always micro-stuttering. It always feels like 30 FPS, even at 40 FPS, but that's not a problem, guys. I mean, it's working. That's the main thing. You can play the game here even without dropping from 30 FPS, although I'm going to a little bit more intensive of an area where the FPS might actually drop from 30. But we still have like quality FSR 3.1, which looks decent in this game, as well as frame generation, as well as like 720p resolution native. So we're gonna try all of that stuff here in this video to see if it becomes a little bit better of an experience. And we can also lock the FPS like I did with the GTX 1660 Ti, because that GPU was also running out of VRAM when I tried it, even though it's a 6GB GPU, and sometimes the frame time would be a flat line, completely smooth, other times it would be like this with the 1650, a little bit jittery, you know, so in that case, it felt a little bit worse, honestly, even though the FPS were higher and stuff, because sometimes it was smooth and you could feel all of that buttery smoothness, you know, and other times it would just get wrecked. So that transition, that discrepancy is not great, and it's obviously very, very noticeable, but here, yeah, it's always a bit crappy of an experience, so you get used to it very quickly. Anyways, you can see it's dropping into the 20s. Not great, not amazing, but we still can drop some settings and use upscaling and so on. So let's enable frame generation, which uses more VRAM, but it actually fixed the stuttering and the frame time issues with the GTX 1660 Ti when I tried it. And look at that. I mean, that's absolutely ridiculous to me. Now, it does not feel like 40 FPS at all. And it is a crappy experience because it's frame generation below 60 FPS. It's always a terrible experience when you do that. In terms of input lag, it's also pretty terrible. I don't have reflex enabled, but I doubt it is going to make a difference, honestly. But it's now enabled. Yeah, input lag is still pretty terrible, even with reflex on, and it looks like we're getting like 20 FPS, honestly. It's not looking like 40. But it fixed our frame time graph, and if we were above 60 FPS, it would make a big difference without all of this stuttering in the visuals and stuff. Now, this is expected. This is exactly what I expect coming from frame generation with a 4GB GPU that was already running out of VRAM previously. So I'm not surprised here or disappointed. It's just how it is, okay? Maybe at 720p it will be stable with frame generation, but here at 1080p it won't save the little GTX 1650. And you can see that GPU usage isn't even maxing out. So that's, again, the VRAM not being enough, not allowing us to utilize the GPU fully and correctly, and this is what we get, a really terrible experience with frame generation. I thought it was going to be a little bit better, honestly, but it is what it is. Anyway, gonna disable that again, and we're gonna use some FSR 3.1 on quality this time, which should improve things by a little bit. With the RX 580, we only saw around like a 6 FPS difference, so about a 10% difference or 12% difference with FSR enabled compared to FSR disabled. So it's not a big difference, but here we only dropped to like the high 20s, so it's probably enough to put us above 30 frames per second the entire time. And actually, right now, the frame time is smooth. Sometimes it still has little spikes there, you know, but look at that. 50-something FPS, visuals are looking decent, although a little bit more pixelated, but who cares? Like, it's FSR 3.1, it's a good implementation, actually, and it looks good on a 1080p monitor at native resolution, you know? And now it's not dropping at all into the 20s. It's getting like 5 more FPS than what we were getting previously. Like, we dropped to 29, now it drops to like 34, actually. It's not bad. You could lock it to 30 once again if you want to get rid of these frame time spikes that we're seeing right now, micro stuttering issues once again, and it's going to be a stable and playable experience. So this could actually have been the minimum requirements GPU, in my opinion. Again, the game has a memory leak issue, so maybe after like 30 minutes or an hour of gameplay, you will need to restart it because it will get very low frames, because the VRAM will fill up, then the RAM will fill up. So yeah, it's probably not going to be great after half an hour, so you gotta keep restarting it, but you know what? This is playable, right? At least for half an hour, it will be playable, and the RAM usage isn't really too high either because we're using low settings as well. The VRAM apparently isn't that big of an issue, but it's definitely the cause of the frame time being weird. But that doesn't make the game unplayable. This is decent, guys. Once again, I thought it was going to be terrible, especially after seeing that the developers didn't even allow 4GB GPUs to run the game at all, to launch it. But here we are, playing the game with a 4GB GPU after the developers removed the limitation, and it's working. Obviously, in boss fights and stuff like that, it will likely drop a little bit further than what we saw here. But again, I doubt it will drop from 30 FPS. So it's going to be an okay experience. And even if it drops, you always have that 720p resolution. And again, you can lock it to like 30 frames per second and have that 30 FPS experience, console-like experience, or last-gen console-like experience, just fine at 30 FPS, without even moving from 30 FPS, without the little frame time spikes that we were seeing, or micro stutters. GPU usage is now at like 50 to 60% most of the time, so there is a lot of headroom there, and it's just a great experience like this, honestly. Again, if you are okay with 30 frames per second, play with the controller, maybe add a little bit of motion blur at the same time, just to disguise the fact that it's low frame rate, and it's going to be a great experience. The story is the main point of this game, and from what I've played so far, and from what I've played of God of War 2018 as well, it's a great story, so it's worth getting the game. If you really are into God of War, give it a try with your 1650. And of course, if you have the GDDR6 version of the card, it's going to be even better. Also, I'm sorry about screen tearing, I have G-Sync enabled, but apparently it's not working with the capture cards with this GPU in particular. Don't know what that's about. I enabled it and I have it enabled on the Nvidia control panel, but it is what it is. Now, to play at 720p resolution natively, you'll actually need to drop down the resolution in your desktop because you can't really do it here, unfortunately. So that's exactly what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna return to the main menu, go to the desktop. Here we go. I'm gonna go to display settings, set this to 720p. There it is. And now it's a very small desktop in the middle of my screen. Now I'm gonna go to the settings here. It says 720p. We're on full screen 720p. Reflex still on. I'm gonna keep it on actually, because why not? It's usually a better experience with it if it doesn't introduce stuttering, and it doesn't in this game. Low settings, obviously, native res. Whoa, 60 plus? No micro stuttering here? Let me check the... Wait, let me stop counting the FPS. I'm gonna check the VRAM usage. It's still above 100% there, but it's not micro stuttering like crazy, like we saw it previously. This is pretty stable, guys. This is absolutely playable. Again, proving my point that maybe this should have been the minimum requirements GPU in this game. Even something slower than this with 4 GB of VRAM might actually be playable as well, as long as it stays above 30 FPS at 720, right? It is pretty decent. 43 FPS there minimums. Yeah, not a problem. Over in this area, it always seems to be a bit more intensive. Oh, there's something over there. Yeah, it's for us to it's something to do with this thing, actually. So I gotta do a combination of that over there, and something that's over in that area over there that I can't really see from this. But yeah, it's pretty weird. I don't know what to do with this. Maybe... Ooh! Oh, wait. Wait a second. Let's do this. Okay, so now the only one left is that one, which needs to be an N, I think. Oh, I figured it out. Also, frame time spikes are back. So whenever you are running out of VRAM, that happens. And that's the N. And we made it. We unlocked the chest. Good stuff. But yeah, that's exactly the same issue or behavior that we had with the 1660 Ti at 1080p native resolution, guys. But going back to that minimum requirements talk, it's 2024 at the same time. Honestly, I think that developers should aim for 1080p lowest settings without any upscaling, just native 1080p resolution for those minimum requirements, in my opinion. And I actually said that in my Horizon Forbidden West minimum versus recommended requirements video, not versus minimum and recommended requirements video. Yeah, but at the same time, seeing that a ton of developers do optimize and do make the system requirements for 720p lowest settings, that's why I'm saying that this should have been the minimum settings or minimum requirements GPU, in my opinion, because it works just fine, as you can see. It's pretty damn good, and maybe this time with these base FPS, the frame generation will work very well. So let's find out. No. Okay, so with a 4 gig GPU, frame generation won't really save it. As you can see, it's micro stuttering, it's barely getting more FPS, and you actually can see that it's not running with the FPS that it's displaying. It feels slower for sure. So frame gen, yeah, forget it. It did save our little GTX 1660 Ti actually, even with VRAM constraints, but here it's not gonna do it. Let's try it with Quality FSR 3.1 lastly for this video at 472p internally, upscaling to 720p. It's pretty interesting to see the quality of it. Like, even here at 472p resolution, it's a better implementation than some FSR 3.0 or FSR 2 point something implementations in other games, even at 1080p. It doesn't look too bad, guys. And especially if you played on a very tiny screen, like a 10-inch screen, for example, which might be the size of this actually at this point. I think it could look very good. So like on a laptop, for example, smaller display, yeah, 720p even with upscaling should work. Although it's only getting like 4 FPS higher than what we saw at native 720, so I think I'd just stick to 720, honestly. It's definitely the better way to do this. I just wanted to take a look at the quality of the upscaler here at this res, which is extremely low, once again, 472p. Alright, guys. That's been it for GTX 1650 in God of War Ragnarok. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know if you're going to buy this game with this GPU. It works. I mean, I don't have major complaints here, honestly, in terms of the performance. I think I'd stick to 1080p with FSR 3.1 quality and the 30 FPS lock, just to be sure that it will never move. I think that's the most stable and most enjoyable experience, although 720p native is still going to provide a great experience if you're after a bit better smoothness or a bit higher FPS. Thanks for watching. Catch you in the next one. Love you all. Bye-bye.